From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melithopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
I think everybody knows by now that monarch butterflies are experiencing a decline here in North America. Now, many people, volunteers, people listening to this show, as well as researchers and organizations are committed to the recovery of these butterflies. But any strategy around butterfly recovery has to understand the mechanisms of decline. And that's where I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, Dr. James Tracy. Now, Dr. Tracy is a postdoc in the Robert Coulson Lab at Texas A&M. He's been working on some really innovative modeling to show a significant mechanism of monarch decline, that is collisions with butterflies on interstates. And he's also come up with some real amazing insights into where these collisions are occurring and how we might be able to reduce those collisions. So in this week's episode, we have Dr. James Tracy talking about how to understand the effect of interstate collision with monarch butterflies this week on Pollination.
All right. Well, welcome, Dr. Tracy, to Pollination.
Hello. How you doing?
Fantastic. You gave a great talk at the Entomological Society of America. We just left the sessions. We're here in Denver on monarchs. And just to begin with, there's a lot of concern over monarch butterflies and their migration patterns. Can you tell us a little bit about, and I guess the other factor of this is that highways and other things are transecting this migration pattern. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the critical points in the migration pattern of these butterflies?
Right. Well, there's something called the Texas, Oklahoma, Mexico funnel, and that's where the spring monarchs come through this narrow area and they lay their eggs in Texas and Oklahoma. And then in the fall, monarchs come down through this narrow area in large numbers in directed flight and cross roadways. And there's actually some high roadkill mortality in Texas and Mexico, so that's something we've been investigating for several years.
Okay, so just to review that, so there's some areas where really a lot of butterflies are moving through. There's a lot of roadways, and there's this potential for roadways having these impacts through collisions mainly. So so you have been looking at this question, and you conducted a research project. Tell us a little bit about how you measured. Is it possible to sort of account for mortality of butterflies? Is it visible? How do you actually measure that?
So we had a large survey area, about 2/3 of the eastern half of Texas, and what we did is set up 100-meter transects every 30 to 100 kilometers along major roadways. And so we might have around 200 transects in a fall period or a spring period when we were doing the surveys. And we not only surveyed the dead monarchs in these 100-meter transects, but the milkweeds that the monarch larvae used as host and that are important nectar plants, and also the non-milkweed nectar plants. And all these are very common along highways, and they're very important resource for the monarch. So there's a positive and negative aspect that we were looking at on these roadways.
And so I imagine as you walk along the roadside, are dead monarchs visible, or do you have to really look before you find them?
Well, sometimes we wouldn't find any in 100 meters, but sometimes we'd find up to 95 dead monarchs. And it would be very visible, and sometimes these hot spots, as we call them, would stretch for miles. Maybe the first year we did the surveys in 2016, there was about an 80-mile stretch of dead monarchs along Interstate 10 in West Texas that was very striking, and TxDOT personnel happened to be out there and saw it, and was part of the impetus that got us funded for the last couple of years looking at this.
Okay, so Texas Department of Agriculture concerned about these butterflies. TxDOT. Okay.
Department of Transportation, yes.
Department of Transportation. Thank you so much. Okay, so you've got this data where you have butterfly plants, and you've got dead butterflies. How were you able to sort of characterize, spatially how different areas are priority? I imagine you saw a lot of variability. How do you boil that down into something that's useful for a Department of Transportation?
Right. So we really had to do random surveys just because we didn't want to just concentrate on areas where there was a lot of roadkill. That would bias the study. So we did survey a large area, but sometimes we would stop and do extra surveys where we saw a lot of milkweed just to check and see if there was a lot of roadkill there too. So we made sure we had enough data to look for correlations, and we did find a correlation where we have a lot of milkweed or a lot of non-milkweed nectar plants. Sometimes in some years we'd get a little bit more monarch roadkill, but we don't know if it's really enough to offset the benefit of these plants to have for the monarchs, and that's something that needs to be looked at more.
And if I recall from your presentation, the presence or absence of those plants were one thing, but the real driver of mortality was something completely different, sort of geographical in character. Can you explain those findings?
Right. So what we found is these large hotspots were located in West Texas along draws. Apparently monarchs will follow draws in arid areas because there's more moisture, more plants, nectar plants. And when they cross the roads in these draws, that's where we're getting the big hotspots. On the coast, it was a totally different picture. The monarchs were crossing bays, and the causeways that cross those bays is where we were seeing the high mortality. And what we think happened there is the monarchs followed a peninsula out into the bay to try to stay over the land, and those peninsulas carried the causeways. And they stayed on those causeways, and that's where they were getting killed.
That's fascinating. So the first one makes sense. You have these draws, maybe some more moisture, more plant density, and so they're coming down these draws, they hit the highway, and then they get hit. But the second one's a little bit more puzzling. So coming down the coast and they hit a peninsula, why are they getting hit on the causeways?
Well, it looks like that they'll stage themselves and sometimes form roosts around these peninsulas before they cross the bay. So they're gathering in large numbers, and then they probably follow these peninsulas and try to hug the land instead of getting out of open water, and maybe even hug the causeways. And, of course, that's where they're going to run into cars.
All right, so I guess the implication of this work, there's two things that come to mind. The first one is this weak relationship between plants and roadsides, that they're, having monarch, having milkweed and nectar plants on roadsides, maybe the benefit outweighs the downsides?
Yeah, we think it probably does. The correlations are very weak, but that's what we need to look at is how many monarchs do you get per milkweed plant along a roadside area versus how many dead monarchs do you get when you have more milkweed plants. And we think it's probably going to be a benefit to have those milkweed plants and nectar plants.
But the big area seems to be where you have these draws, these hot spots where mortality is occurring. Can anything be done? Can Department of Transportation do any kind of mitigation on existing roadways to lessen this mortality?
Yes, TxDOT is very interested in trying to do something about this, and what they wanted us to look at is something called flight diversion nets. And these have been used in Taiwan successfully to reduce road mortality by over 85% for the migratory purple crow butterfly. They fly in large numbers over this bridge every spring. But when they put up the nets, they cut down the mortality by 85%. We think that the same thing would work for the monarchs, and they're wanting to test that out along Interstate 10, where we have these hot spots, and also along the causeways where we have on the coast.
Can you describe these nets? I'm having a hard time envisioning what this might look like on the side of a road.
So the nets are made out of an orange shade cloth tarp. They're 12 foot high, and they're meant to be sturdy in the winds that you can get along the coast and out in West Texas, but also something that the air can pass through, but definitely the monarchs would want to pass over, and if they can keep their height as they cross the interstate, which is the key, which is the interstates are very wide out there, then maybe we can reduce the mortality.
Fantastic. And I guess the final question I have for you is, you showed at the beginning of your talk the decline in monarchs across the U.S. Do you have any sense of how important this roadkill mortality is in the scheme of things?
Yes, so there's been a 75% decline of monarchs in the last 25 years, and we fitted an exponential model to that. It shows that there's a 7% annual decline. And so 7% of the monarchs are going down annually, but we found out that over a third of that 7% can be attributed to roadkill in Texas. Roadkill comprises about 2.5% of the overwintering population. So 2.5% is a big part of the 7% decline.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much for your work, and I'm looking forward to seeing more findings out of this research. It's certainly of national importance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn, Sin, and Neil, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.